Bloodborne has some of the densest, most fragmented lore of any game ever made, and every single location in it is hiding a story that most players never fully put together. I put this video together because I kept finding myself reading item descriptions at 2 in the morning, cross-referencing notes, and realizing that the locations in Bloodborne are not just backdrops, they are archives. Every alley, every rooftop, every hidden workshop has a history that the game almost never explains out loud. So I decided to gather all of it, organize it, and narrate it in a way that could actually be absorbed rather than pieced together in 10 browser tabs. One choice I made when assembling this was to follow a loose geographic and narrative progression, moving through the game roughly the way a new hunter moves through Yharnam, but allowing myself to detour into history and faction lore whenever a location demanded it. I also made the choice to de-emphasize some of the more speculative cosmological theories in favor of grounding each location in what its architecture, its enemies, and its item descriptions actually suggest about the people who lived and died there. The cosmic horror is still present, but I wanted the human tragedy to land first. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. Central Yharnam. Central Yharnam is the first place most hunters ever see, and because it comes first, it is easy to assume it is simple. It is not. The streets of Central Yharnam are a compressed record of an entire civilization's collapse, and the more time you spend reading the walls, the more the extent of that collapse becomes clear. What looks like a Gothic city in the middle of a plague is actually a city that was already dying long before the plague arrived, its foundations compromised by decades of secret experimentation and quiet corruption that the average citizen never had the chance to understand. The layout of Central Yharnam suggests a city that was, at some point, genuinely prosperous. The buildings are tall and densely packed in a way that points toward a merchant class and a population that had reason to build upward. There are signs of old commerce, old civic pride, wide enough streets to move goods through, bridges connecting district to district, as though the city expected its various quarters to remain in communication with one another. This was not always a charnel house. It was a real place where people went about their lives. What the architecture also reveals, when you look closely, is the degree to which the church had embedded itself into the physical fabric of the city. The healing church did not simply build a cathedral and call it a day. It inserted itself into the street-level texture of Yharnam, placing its symbols, its imagery, and its infrastructure into the ordinary flow of daily life. One possible reading of this is that the church wanted to be inescapable, not in a sinister way at first, but in the way that institutions which genuinely believe in their own mission tend to become omnipresent. The church believed it had something Yharnam needed, and it made sure Yharnam could not forget that. The healing church's central claim was that Yharnam's medical knowledge was unmatched anywhere in the world. This was true, in its way. Yharnam had developed techniques and treatments that were far beyond what other cities could offer, and people came from great distances to receive those treatments. The city's economy was partly built on medical tourism of a kind, travellers arriving sick and leaving healed, or arriving desperate and leaving with something that at least resembled hope. This gave the church both revenue and influence, and it gave the city an identity built around the idea of healing. But the knowledge that made Yharnam's medicine so powerful was not entirely of human origin. The church's deeper research, the research it kept out of the public eye, was informed by contact with something much older. The old blood, as it came to be called, was a substance discovered in the ruins beneath Yharnam, in the labyrinthine chalice dungeons that honeycomb the bedrock beneath the city. The blood had properties that ordinary medicine could not explain, and the church's scholars recognized its potential almost immediately. The use of the old blood as a medical treatment began gradually. At first it was reserved for the most extreme cases, patients for whom nothing else had worked. The results were remarkable. Wounds closed, diseases retreated, patients who had been near death found themselves standing and walking within days. Word spread, and the demand for blood ministration grew. The church found itself in possession of something that people would do almost anything to receive, and that position of power had a logic to it that was difficult to resist following. Central Yharnam street-level residents were for a long time the primary recipients and advocates of blood ministration. The practice became embedded in the culture. Blood was not just medicine in Yharnam, it became a source of civic pride, a point of identity, the thing that made Yharnam different from every other city in the world. To receive the blood was to participate in something the city believed was genuinely sacred. The healing church encouraged this belief because it was not entirely wrong. The blood did heal. The problem was what else it did over time. The early signs of what the blood would eventually do to people were probably visible in Central Yharnam long before the night the game takes place on. The beast plague, as the citizens came to understand it, did not appear overnight. It crept in, case by case, person by person, in the form of behavioural changes that were easy to rationalise as other things. Increased aggression, sensitivity to certain sounds, a gradual loss of the qualities that made a person recognisably human. These things could be explained away for a long time before they could not. By the time the hunt began, Central Yharnam had already been through multiple outbreaks. The city had a system for dealing with them, a machinery of denial and containment that the church had helped to construct. Hunters were dispatched, fires were lit. The infected were put down in the streets while their neighbours looked away and told themselves this was a necessary part of living in a city that had access to such powerful medicine. The cost was understood, but never spoken aloud in polite company. The Yharnam you walk through as a hunter is a city mid-collapse, but what the environment suggests is that this collapse had been managed and deferred for a very long time before it finally became unmanageable. The barricades in the streets were not built the night before your arrival. They are weathered. The warning bells, the oil drums set up for burning, the raised platforms that give the more organised citizens a height advantage over the beasts below, all of this infrastructure has the look of something that was installed with at least some planning. Yharnam had prepared for this. It had just not prepared well enough. The torch-bearing hunters you encounter in the early streets are not city guards in any traditional sense. They are citizens who decided to arm themselves and participate in the hunt, which the church had long framed as a civic duty. The hunter's workshop had trained official hunters for generations, but the church also cultivated a broader culture of vigilante participation, ordinary people taking up torches and pitchforks to defend their streets. This culture points toward a society that had internalized the idea that some of its members were inevitably going to become monsters, and that dealing with those monsters was everyone's responsibility. The lamps that dot Central Yharnam have a dual quality that the law only gestures at. They are practical, providing light in a city that has reason to fear the dark. But they also mark the presence of the dream, the hunter's dream, the strange state of existence that the player's character occupies during the hunt. The lamp connections suggest that the dream is anchored to specific places in Yharnam, places that have significance to the old hunter's workshop or to the figures who shaped it. Central Yharnam is dense with these anchors, which points toward just how central this district was to the hunt's history. The Great Bridge in Central Yharnam, where the player encounters the first cleric beast, is one of the more symbolically loaded locations in the early game. Bridges in Yharnam connect districts and allow the city to function as a unified whole, but this particular bridge sits at an elevation that gives it a commanding view of several surrounding areas. The cleric beast's presence here points towards something specific. This creature was a member of the healing church, a cleric whose blood ministration had progressed too far. The church's own servants were not immune to the transformation they were supposed to be managing. The presence of a cleric beast on a major public bridge suggests either that this transformation happened very recently and violently, or that the church had lost enough control of the situation that even its most visible servants were becoming dangerous in public spaces. Either reading is troubling. The bridge is not a hidden alley or a private chamber. It is a place where people cross from one part of the city to another. A cleric becoming a beast on that bridge is a statement about how far the collapse had progressed. The sewers beneath Central Yharnam carry a history that is easy to miss because players often move through them quickly and unhappily. But the sewer system is actually a clue to the city's older infrastructure, the pre-church Yharnam that existed before the healing church arrived and began reshaping the city around its own priorities. The architecture of the sewers is older than most of the buildings above, and the presence of certain creatures and items in those sewers suggests that the underground spaces of Yharnam have been in use for purposes the surface city preferred not to acknowledge for a very long time. The Thumerians, the civilization that inhabited Yharnam before the humans who built the city as we see it, left traces throughout the underground spaces. The Chalice dungeons are the most dramatic example of this, but the sewers and the lower passages of Central Yharnam show their influence as well. The Thumerians were a people who had made contact with the Great Ones long before the healing church began its experiments, and the physical substrate of Yharnam is saturated with that earlier contact in ways the church may not have fully understood, even when it began exploiting the resources it found there. The dogs in Central Yharnam deserve a moment's consideration. They appear throughout the district in various states, some chained and driven mad, some already transformed into something more threatening. Dogs in Yharnam point toward the class structure of the city. Keeping a dog was not something every resident could afford, and the specific kinds of dogs present in the wealthier parts of Central Yharnam versus the more crowded lower districts are different. The animals mirror the fate of their owners in a quiet way that the game never calls attention to, but which is consistent once you notice it. The windows of Central Yharnam's buildings are another detail worth sitting with. Many of them are boarded or barricaded from the inside. This points toward residents who are still alive, or were still alive when the barricades were put up, choosing to seal themselves in rather than participate in the hunt or flee the city. The sounds you sometimes hear, through doors and windows, whispering, crying, someone quietly praying, are the traces of those people. They represent a middle category between the hunters and the beasts, civilians who understood enough about what was happening to be terrified, but not enough to act. The insight mechanic in Bloodborne has a physical expression in the Central Yharnam environment that most players register instinctively without necessarily thinking about what it implies. Certain things are only visible with enough insight. Certain enemies change character depending on how much the player's character has seen. This points toward the idea that Central Yharnam is not the straightforward, physical space it first appears to be. It is a space that contains more information than an ordinary mind can process, and the human beings who lived here were over time absorbing and being changed by that surplus of information. The messengers, those small creatures that appear near lamps and in the dream, have a connection to Central Yharnam that the lore only lightly touches on. They are thought to be the remnants of hunters who came before, reduced over time to something small and quiet. If that is one possible reading, then the concentration of messengers in and around Central Yharnam points toward just how many hunters have passed through this district, how many people have stood at these same corners and looked up at these same rooftops, and eventually been worn down to something barely there. The burning of buildings in Central Yharnam was not entirely the work of the night's chaos. Some of the fires had been set deliberately, earlier, as a containment strategy. The church had a long history of using fire as a tool of plague management, and the scorch marks on certain walls, and the pattern of which buildings are most heavily damaged versus which are still structurally intact suggests a strategy behind at least some of the destruction. Someone at some point before the hunt you participate in made calculated decisions about which parts of the city could be sacrificed. The Yharnam stone, an item found much later in the game but connected in lore to the city's deepest history, suggests that Yharnam itself has a kind of consciousness, or at least a kind of residue. The city is not just a collection of buildings, it is the accumulated weight of everything that has happened in it, and that weight has become something almost material. Walking through Central Yharnam is walking through a place that remembers, even if nothing in it can tell you what it remembers. In language you can easily understand. The cathedral ward's proximity to Central Yharnam creates a kind of gradient that the game uses architecturally. Central Yharnam is civic and commercial space, with the marks of ordinary life still visible beneath the carnage. As you move toward the cathedral ward, the buildings become more ecclesiastical, the street furniture becomes more religious, the entire visual vocabulary shifts toward the church. This gradient suggests that the church had been deliberately pushing its influence outward from its central position, colonizing the civic space of the city with its own imagery and infrastructure. The 3-story buildings of Central Yharnam, climbable in places, give the player a vertical experience of the city that most of the residents would never have had. From ground level, Central Yharnam is claustrophobic. The buildings pressing in, the streets narrow, the sky barely visible. From the rooftops you can see the scope of the city, the cathedral in the distance, the river below, the scale of what was built here. That vertical contrast points toward a city whose inhabitants were largely limited to a ground-level experience, unable to see the larger context of which they were a part. The workshop towers in the early Central Yharnam area have a particular atmosphere that distinguishes them from the residential buildings. The workshop structures have the smell, in a visual sense, of industry and purpose. These were not places where people simply lived. They were places where things were made, modified, tested. The hunter's workshop had a presence throughout the city, not just in its formal headquarters, and the tools and materials scattered through these workshop-adjacent buildings point toward a distributed infrastructure of preparation for the hunt that had been in place for a very long time. The werewolves of Central Yharnam occupy a specific social position that their placement in the game reflects. They are found in the most densely populated streets, near the residential buildings, in the places where ordinary people would have been going about their daily lives. This is not accidental. The werewolf transformation, which is one of the earlier and more common forms of beast transformation, tended to take people who were receiving regular blood ministration, which was most of the population. The beasts of Central Yharnam were the neighbours. In many cases, they were probably the family. The bell-ringing women in the area are a specific nightmare detail that gets more disturbing the more you think about it. They are not combatants in any traditional sense. They are performing a ritual, ringing bells that call other creatures into the hunt. Where did this ritual come from? Who taught it to them? And why are ordinary-looking women performing it in the middle of a city, collapsing into beasthood? The bells themselves have a specific sound that the game makes deeply unsettling, and that unsettling quality points toward bells having been a significant part of the church's practice, in ways that had been inverted or corrupted into something the church never intended. The lore of the old hunter medallion and related items suggests that there had been earlier generations of hunters in Central Yharnam, men and women who had hunted these same streets in previous outbreaks, and who had been celebrated and then forgotten as the city normalised the practice of hunting its own citizens. The idea that Yharnam had been through this before, perhaps many times, and had managed to pull back from the edge each time, gives the current outbreak a particular quality of tragic inevitability. This time is different not because of anything essentially new, but because the accumulated weight of all the previous times had finally become too much. The gate at the far end of Central Yharnam, which opens into the cathedral ward, has the feel of a boundary that was once carefully maintained. The passage between the civic district and the church district would not always have been as freely accessible as it is on the night of the hunt. There would have been gatekeepers, processes, reasons why ordinary citizens did not simply wander into the church's territory. The absence of those gatekeepers on this night, the gates hanging open or unguarded, points toward the degree to which the normal structures of Yharnam society had dissolved. The fog that permeates Central Yharnam is a detail that rewards attention. It is not just an aesthetic choice. The fog has a quality that suggests it is not entirely natural, that it is part of the same uncanny atmosphere that the waking dream produces in Yharnam on hunt nights. Residents who describe the nights of the hunt in hushed terms would probably have mentioned the fog, the way it reduced the city to a series of immediate impressions, the way it made the familiar strange and the strange somehow familiar. The fog is part of the hunt's machinery. The statues and architectural decorations in Central Yharnam carry iconography that tells a compressed version of the church's theology. There are figures of healing, figures of prayer, figures of transformation. The transformation imagery, which appears in a positive register in the earliest church symbolism, suggesting the transformation of the sick into the healed, had taken on a different character as the church's understanding of the old blood deepened. The same transformation that was once framed as healing was later understood to lead somewhere the church increasingly did not want to talk about. The water wheel in the lower parts of Central Yharnam points toward older, more mechanical aspects of the city's infrastructure. Before blood ministration became the city's central industry and identity, Yharnam had an economy built on more conventional foundations: grain, textiles, trade. The water wheel is a remnant of that older Yharnam, still functioning, still turning, utterly indifferent to the carnage happening above it. There is something quietly devastating about that image. The cleric beast, when it falls from the bridge, falls into a lower district, into the streets below, and this fall has a symbolic quality that mirrors the fall of the church's ideals into the material horror of the beasthood. The church began with something that could genuinely be called a healing mission. That mission fell gradually and then suddenly into exactly the thing it was supposed to be fighting against. The bridge is where that fall becomes physical and impossible to deny. The lanterns and torches carried by the citizens who are still fighting suggest that fire is one of the few things that still works against the beasts in a reliable way. The church would have known this. The workshop would have known this. Fire as a tool of the hunt predates everything else, and its continued effectiveness points toward the beasts, whatever else they have become, still being physical creatures that burn. That practicality is almost comforting in the context of everything else that Yharnam implies about the nature of reality. The architecture of the buildings where the torch-bearing citizens have barricaded themselves reflects a working-class Yharnam that the church did not design for prestige. These are functional buildings built to house workers and their families, built to be efficient rather than beautiful. The church's aesthetic, all soaring arches and elaborate stonework, is visible in the distance from these buildings, but does not penetrate them. There is a class distinction written into the city's fabric that the plague has not erased. The wealthy parts of Yharnam were always separated from the parts where people actually lived close to the ground. The item descriptions you find in Central Yharnam carry a tone that is worth noting. They are not panicked. They are matter-of-fact in a way that suggests the people who wrote them, or the culture that produced them, had long since accepted a certain level of horror as the baseline of normal life. The antidotes and the quicksilver bullets and the blood vials are all described in the language of routine, of things you simply need when you go out at night in Yharnam. That normalization of the horrifying is one of the most disturbing things the law communicates. The old Yharnam, visible from certain vantage points in Central Yharnam, is a reminder that the city has layers, that what you are walking through is not the original Yharnam, but a city built partly on top of an older city that was itself already built on top of older structures. Each layer of Yharnam adds another stratum of history, another set of people who lived and died and were forgotten, another set of decisions that led inexorably to the present. Central Yharnam is not just one city, it is several cities stacked in the same location. The locked doors throughout Central Yharnam, doors that cannot be opened from the outside but that have light visible beneath them, are one of the game's most quietly effective horror details. Someone is in there. Someone chose to lock that door, and they are still there, on the other side, in the dark or in the faint light, listening to what is happening outside and deciding again and again not to open the door. The doors of Central Yharnam are a record of individual decisions made under impossible pressure. The Yharnam residents who throw Molotovs from windows, who shout at you to leave or to die, who have not been transformed but who have also not organised into any coherent defence, represent a particular failure of community. Yharnam's culture of the hunt had created individual participation but had not created solidarity. Each household was responsible for its own survival, and the logic of that individualism had made collective action impossible precisely when it was most needed. The people shouting from windows are not wrong about the danger, they simply have no idea how to address it together. The child crying in a house in the early part of Central Yharnam is a detail that stays with players long after they have moved on to other areas. Children are almost absent from Yharnam as characters with presence and agency, and this crying voice, heard but not seen, is a reminder of what was at stake for ordinary people in this city. The hunt was not an abstraction to whoever that child was waiting for. It was the night their parent or sibling or neighbour went out and did not come back. The crows of Yharnam, large and unnervingly aware, are present throughout Central Yharnam in numbers that suggest the city had been producing casualties long enough for a significant scavenger population to establish itself. Birds that thrive on the dead are not attracted to a single night's violence. They accumulate over time, over many nights, over many hunts. The crows of Central Yharnam are a census of the dead, a way of reading the long history of the hunt in the population of birds that has grown fat on it. The way Central Yharnam connects to the sewers, which connect in turn to the deeper structures of the city, reflects the game's overall architecture of descent. Yharnam is a city that keeps going down. Every time you find a lower level, there is another level below it, and the lower you go, the older and stranger things become. Central Yharnam is the surface of this descent, the place where the city is most recognisably a city, before the architecture starts to change into something that has less to do with human habitation and more to do with whatever the great ones left behind beneath the stone. The specific time of night when the hunt takes place, always deep in the night, always before dawn, is a choice that the city itself seems to have internalised. Hunt nights in Yharnam are not random. They are called, triggered by conditions that the church had developed over generations of experience with the old blood and its effects. The architecture of Central Yharnam, the placement of the oil canisters and the fire pots and the barriers, all of it points toward a city that had rehearsed this night many times. They knew it was coming. They had always known. The gates of Central Yharnam that lead to the lower areas, to the areas near the river and the aqueducts, suggest a city that had a relationship with the water that ran beneath it. Water is a recurring element in Bloodborne's geography, always flowing downward, always connecting the surface to the depths, always associated with the older and stranger aspects of the lore. The waterways of Central Yharnam are not just practical infrastructure, they are arteries that connect the city to its own deep past. The absence of children as visible characters in Central Yharnam, outside of that single crying voice, points toward one of two possibilities. Either the city had managed to evacuate or hide its youngest residents before the night became unmanageable, or the children of Central Yharnam had already been among the first casualties, which would explain why the surviving adults have a particular quality of grief beneath their rage. The law does not answer this directly, but the absence is loud enough to notice. The bag-carrier enemy, large and lurching, dragging bodies in sacks, is one of Central Yharnam's most genuinely unsettling presences. What it suggests about the logistics of the hunt is something the game allows you to piece together yourself. Someone has been collecting the dead. Someone has been organising the aftermath of the hunt with enough regularity and enough practical purpose to produce an enemy type dedicated to that work. The hunt has a supply chain. Central Yharnam is where some of that supply chain is most visible. The ambient soundscape of Central Yharnam deserves mention even in a purely textual discussion of the lore, because the sounds are part of what the location communicates. Distant bells, fire, the low sound of something large moving in streets you cannot see. The occasional human voice, truncated. These sounds layer over each other in a way that suggests the city is not silent. It is full of things happening just out of sight, a constant peripheral horror that the architecture forces you to move through rather than away from. The central plaza of Yharnam, the area near the large lamp at the beginning, functions as a kind of orientation point for the rest of the district. It is the place where the city's main routes intersect, and its openness, unusual in a district that is mostly narrow streets, suggests it was once a public gathering space. Markets, announcements, civic ceremonies. The plaza is large enough to hold a crowd, and whatever crowds once stood in it, whatever they came to celebrate or mourn, or simply buy and sell, had been replaced by the specific and terrible crowd of the hunt night. The final impression that Central Yharnam leaves, when you turn back and look at it from the gate to the cathedral ward, is of a city that was proud of itself right up until the moment it wasn't. The buildings are good buildings, the streets were laid out with some care, the infrastructure worked for a while. Yharnam was not a city that had always been cursed, it was a city that chose, incrementally and for understandable reasons, to engage with something it did not fully understand, and it kept choosing that until the choice was made for it. Central Yharnam is the record of those choices, written in stone and fire, and the absence of the people who once lived there. The hunt will continue through the night, and Central Yharnam will still be there when it ends. The same buildings, the same streets, the same fog lying low over the cobblestones. Whether anyone will be left to walk those streets in the morning is a question the district itself refuses to answer. Chapter 2. The Cathedral Ward. The Cathedral Ward announces itself differently than Central Yharnam. Where the lower city is claustrophobic and domestic, the Cathedral Ward is designed to make you feel small. The streets are wider here, the buildings taller, and every architectural line points upward toward the grand cathedral that sits at the district's highest point, like a claim about the nature of the universe. This is not an accident of geography. The Cathedral Ward was built to communicate the church's power, and every element of its design is a deliberate statement about who was in charge of Yharnam and why. The Healing Church did not build its central presence in the heart of the commercial district. It built it above the city, on elevated ground, accessible by a long climb that would have served as a kind of physical pilgrimage for worshippers and petitioners. The ascent to the cathedral would have reinforced the church's message with every step. By the time a citizen reached the cathedral's doors, they would have been physically reminded that the church occupied a higher position than the rest of the city, not just spiritually, but literally. Architecture as theology, and theology as power. The elevated walkways and the stone bridges of the cathedral ward connect buildings at heights that most residents of the lower city would never have reached. This upper level of the district suggests a class of people who moved through the city at height, who had access to elevated passages and rooftop connections that allowed them to navigate Yharnam without ever descending to the street-level experience of ordinary citizens. The church's servants and its upper clergy would have moved through this elevated network as a matter of course. The separation was spatial and social simultaneously. The cathedral ward's relationship to the healing church creates a specific kind of architectural double. The church is present in every building in this district, but not always in the same form. There are the public-facing aspects of the church, the cathedral itself, the visible charitable institutions, the places where citizens came to receive blood ministration. And then there are the less public aspects, the workshop connections, the research facilities, the passages that lead deeper into the church's actual work. The cathedral ward contains both, often within the same building, and the transition between them is rarely announced. The School of Mensis had its formal operations elsewhere in the game, but the cathedral ward shows signs of the broader intellectual culture that the school represented within the church. The church was not only a healing institution, it was a research institution, and the pursuit of knowledge about the old blood and what lay behind it had produced a scholarly class whose presence is visible in the items and the environmental storytelling of the cathedral ward. Books, instruments, the remains of experiments conducted in places that were not quite secret, but were not exactly public either. The amygdala creatures that become visible in the cathedral ward with sufficient insight are one of the game's most profound environmental revelations. They are there the entire time, enormous, clinging to the buildings, physically present in the district, and yet invisible to anyone who has not seen enough of the game's deeper strangeness. One possible reading is that the cathedral ward has always been inhabited by these creatures, that the church built its district in a place that was already occupied, and that the entire history of the ward has been conducted in the shadow of presences the residents could not perceive. The insight-dependent visibility of the amygdalae points toward the church's relationship with the Great Ones, being more direct and physical than its public theology suggested. The church spoke of transcendence, of ascending to a higher form of existence through contact with the old blood. What the amygdala suggests is that the higher forms of existence had been present all along, attached to the very buildings where the church performed its public ceremonies, and that the threshold between the church's aspirational theology and the actual reality of what the Great Ones were had always been much thinner than the church was comfortable admitting. The Grand Cathedral itself, when you finally reach it, is a building that has been many things. It was the church's public face, its place of ceremony and authority. It was also, at some point, the site of specific events in the church's internal history that the lore only partially illuminates. The Vicar Amelia encounter takes place in this space, and the presence of a church leader in the process of becoming a beast in the cathedral's central hall is a statement about the endpoint of the church's theology that is almost unbearably direct. The healing mission has arrived at the cathedral and transformed into the very thing it claimed to be fighting. Vicar Amelia's prayer, which she recites even in the midst of her transformation, is one of the most striking moments of environmental storytelling in the cathedral ward. The prayer is about finding something in the darkness, about ascending through bestial experience to something higher. This is the church's actual theology, stripped of its public presentation, revealed as a doctrine that genuinely believed that the transformation process, properly managed and properly understood, led somewhere worth going. The tragedy of Amelia is that the destination the prayer describes may not be what she thinks it is. The altar of the Grand Cathedral, behind Vicar Amelia, contains the gold pendant and the password that opens the way to Old Yharnam. This connection between the cathedral and Old Yharnam is one of the more significant geographic relationships in the game. Old Yharnam was the site of an earlier outbreak, an earlier attempt to manage the beast plague that ended in fire and the sealing of an entire district. The cathedral holds the key to that sealed district, which suggests the church had not simply abandoned Old Yharnam, but had maintained a specific and deliberate relationship with it, keeping the memory and the access point within the cathedral itself. The choir, the church's most secretive and advanced research faction, had its headquarters in the upper parts of the cathedral ward, in the healing church workshop and the orphanage that sits above it. The physical presence of the choir in this district suggests that the church's most dangerous work was being conducted within earshot of the ordinary citizens who came to receive blood ministration in the lower levels of the same buildings. The church had not entirely separated its healing mission from its research mission. They were conducted in the same place, at different elevations. The Healing Church Workshop is a space that tells a very specific story about the relationship between the church and the Hunter's Workshop. The two organisations had once been united, and the physical proximity of the church's workshop facilities to the main cathedral reflects that earlier unity. But the split, when it came, left architectural traces. Spaces that had been designed for collaboration were repurposed for more specialised functions. Doorways that had connected the two organisations' work were closed or redirected. The architecture of the cathedral ward carries the scar of the workshop's separation from the church. The choir's research into eyes on the inside, and the specific practices associated with that research, had a physical manifestation in the orphanage. The orphanage was not primarily a place where the church raised children out of charity, though it may have begun that way. It became a facility where the choir conducted experiments that required subjects who had no advocates, no family connections, no one to ask uncomfortable questions about what was happening to them. The building's exterior, beautiful and imposing, was the church's usual public face. The interior was something else entirely. The Tomb of Eden, accessible from the cathedral ward, is a significant location that the game treats almost casually. Eden is a formless great one, present everywhere but visible nowhere, and the tomb dedicated to Eden, in the heart of the church's own district, points toward the church's internal theology, having a specific relationship with this particular entity. The formless Eden suggests a conception of divinity that precedes form, that exists prior to the physical manifestation that makes the other great ones perceivable. The church's relationship with Eden may have been its oldest and most foundational contact with the great ones. The Gascoigne encounter, which takes place on the boundary between Central Yharnam and the cathedral ward, is relevant to understanding both districts. Gascoigne is a hunter who has gone too deep, a man whose immersion in the hunt has consumed him to the point where his beast transformation is not just a physical process, but an identity collapse. The music box, the tool his daughter uses to reach through the beast transformation, points toward the idea that there are human connections strong enough to temporarily arrest the transformation process. The fact that it only temporarily arrests it is what makes the encounter devastating. The cathedral ward's relationship with the upper city, the areas that become accessible from it, suggests that the church had organised Yharnam vertically as well as horizontally. As you ascend through the ward, the buildings become more specialised, more institutional, more clearly designed for purposes that have nothing to do with ordinary civic life. The path from the street level of the cathedral ward to the orphanage is a path through the church's hierarchy, from its public presence to its most private operations. The specific items found throughout the cathedral ward paint a picture of a religious culture that had developed a sophisticated internal language. The gestures, the blood gems, the notes left by church servants point toward an organisation with deep internal traditions, rituals that had been refined over generations, a way of understanding the world that was coherent and internally consistent even when it led to practices that would be considered monstrous from the outside. The church believed in what it was doing. The cathedral ward is the record of that belief in its most concentrated form. The Alfred questline, which is closely connected to the cathedral ward, introduces one of the game's most unsettling human characters precisely because Alfred is so genuinely sincere. He is a student of Ligarius, which connects him to a specific faction within the church that had declared war on the vile bloods of Canehurst. Alfred's presence in the cathedral ward, his earnest recitation of his mission, his complete commitment to a task that has been twisted far beyond any reasonable understanding of its original purpose, is a portrait of religious conviction that has been separated from its ethical foundations and continued as pure commitment without content. The path through the cathedral ward that connects to the Forbidden Woods is another of those threshold connections that the district uses to organise the game's geography. The Forbidden Woods, the area of hidden research and secret histories, is accessed through a passage that the church controlled. The control of that passage suggests that the church understood what was in the woods, or at least understood enough to want to manage access to it. The Forbidden Woods secrets were the church's secrets, and the cathedral ward was the gatehouse. The statues in the cathedral ward are more formally executed than the decorative work in Central Yharnam, which reflects the resources and the ambitions of the institution that commissioned them. These are not folk art or neighbourhood decoration. They are statements of theological position executed with the best available craftsmanship, placed in deliberate locations to reinforce specific ideas. The imagery on these statues, carefully examined, tells a version of the church's official history, the public narrative it wanted citizens and visitors to absorb about its origins and its mission. The suspicious beggar, if encountered in the cathedral ward, is one of the game's most quietly horrifying characters. He appears to be simply a victim of circumstance, someone displaced by the hunt, someone seeking shelter. The revelation of what he actually is points toward the idea that the cathedral ward, despite its religious authority and its imposing architecture, has no special protection against the very things the church claims to be fighting. The ward is not safe because it is sacred. The sacred status of the ward is itself a kind of illusion. The lanterns placed throughout the cathedral ward have a different quality than those in Central Yharnam. Where the lower district's lanterns feel like practical necessities, emergency lighting in a crisis, the cathedral ward's lanterns have a more ceremonial character, integrated into the architecture rather than added to it. This suggests that the ward had always expected to function at night, that the hunt nights were not an interruption of the district's normal activities, but were, in some sense, built into its design. The windows of the cathedral ward, those that face the night sky, are larger and more elaborate than the windows in the lower city. They are designed to let in light during the day, to make the interior spaces feel open and elevated, connected to the sky above rather than the earth below. At night, those same windows frame the dark sky and whatever is visible in it. The church's architecture had been designed to look upward, and at night, what is upward in Yharnam is not always what ordinary human beings are comfortable looking at. The blood-splattered floors of the grand cathedral, when you reach them, have a specific quality that separates them from the general carnage of the hunt. This blood is old and new simultaneously, layered, suggesting that the cathedral had seen violence before the current night and had not been fully cleaned between incidents. The church's public space had been the site of things that its public image would not have accommodated, and the floor was honest in a way that the church's official presentation was not. The small details of the cathedral ward, the candles still burning, the offerings still placed before altar figures, the prayer books left open to specific pages, point toward the hunt having interrupted the district's ordinary religious life mid-ceremony. Someone had been in the middle of a religious practice when the night became unmanageable. The offerings and the candles were left exactly where they were, mid-ritual when whoever was performing them stopped performing them. The cathedral ward contains dozens of these abandoned midpoints, ceremonies that were never completed. The giant lost children, the enormous figures encountered in the upper ward near the orphanage, are one of the cathedral ward's most complex enemies in terms of what they suggest about the church's actual relationship with the Great Ones. These are not beasts in the conventional sense. They have a different origin, connected to the choir's research and their presence in the spaces adjacent to the orphanage points directly toward the experiments that were conducted there and the specific direction that research was trying to go. The transition from the cathedral ward to the Forbidden Woods is marked by a specific change in architecture that is worth noting. The carefully cut stone of the church's buildings gives way to something rawer, older, less intentional looking. The church's stonework had meaning behind every choice of shape and placement. The transition zone, the passage between the ward and the woods, has the quality of a place where the church's intentionality ran out, where the designed world ended and something else began. That threshold is not just geographic, it is a comment on the limits of the church's knowledge. The music of the cathedral ward is distinct from Central Yharnam's soundscape in a way that supports the architectural distinction between the two districts. Where Central Yharnam is full of chaos and immediacy, the cathedral ward has a quality that suggests ceremony even in ruin. The church had invested in the sonic environment of its central district in the same way it had invested in the visual environment. Even the sounds of the ward were designed to reinforce a particular experience of what the church wanted people to feel in its presence. The blood-drunk hunters encountered in the cathedral ward are a specific and pointed detail. These are hunters, people trained by the workshop or the church to be protectors of the city, who have consumed enough blood to lose their judgment and their identities. They are not beasts in the full sense, but they are not sane in any useful sense either. The presence of blood-drunk hunters in the cathedral ward suggests that the people most trusted to manage the hunt's dangers were themselves being managed by those same dangers, and that the church had either not noticed or not chosen to address this. The old gate connecting the cathedral ward to Canehurst, accessible only under specific conditions, is one of the district's most historically charged architectural features. Canehurst was Yharnam's aristocratic rival, a castle city with its own relationship to the old blood that differed from the church's approach in ways that made the two institutions deeply hostile to each other. The existence of a gate connecting the cathedral ward to Canehurst, even a sealed gate, points toward a time when the two were in closer contact, when the hostility had not yet calcified into the formal enmity of the vile bloods and the executioners. The forbidden grave area of the cathedral ward, containing the path to the Thumerian labyrinths, is the district's most direct connection to the deep history beneath Yharnam. The graves here are not human graves in the conventional sense. They mark the presence of the Pthumerians, the older civilization, whose material and spiritual legacy the church had been exploiting and building upon. Placing these graves in the heart of the church's own district suggests either that the church had deliberately marked this connection, or that the connection was simply impossible to hide, the past pressing up through the present, no matter how carefully the present tried to build over it. The cathedral ward is ultimately a district that tells the story of an institution that overreached. The church's ambition, its genuine belief in the value of what it was pursuing, its organisational competence in building the infrastructure of the ward, all of this is legible in the architecture and the items and the quest lines that move through it. But the endpoints are also legible. Vicar Amelia praying in the ruins of her own transformation, the choir's experiments visible in the faces of their subjects, the blood-drunk hunters guarding nothing with murderous intent. The cathedral ward is beautiful and damned simultaneously, and that combination is precisely what makes it one of the game's most fully realised spaces. The path through the cathedral ward always feels like an ascent toward something, even when you know what is waiting at the top. That quality of ascent, the feeling that you're approaching a revelation, is the church's greatest architectural achievement. Whatever the revelation turns out to be, the approach to it was designed by people who genuinely believed it would be worth the climb. Chapter 3. Old Yharnam. Old Yharnam is sealed, and the sealing is the first thing the location asks you to understand. Before you reach the area's horrors, before you meet Jura on the rooftops, before you understand what happened here, you encounter the fact of the closure. Someone decided that this part of the city was finished, that whatever had happened here was beyond recovery, and that the appropriate response was to wall it off and never speak of it again. Old Yharnam is the thing the church decided not to talk about. The burning of Old Yharnam was not a spontaneous event, it was a decision. The church had the resources and the organisation to conduct a targeted burning of an entire district, to set fires in a systematic enough way that the district would be rendered uninhabitable, and to then construct barriers that would prevent easy re-entry. This level of organised destruction requires planning, requires the authorisation of leadership, requires the agreement of multiple factions within the church's hierarchy. Someone signed off on burning Old Yharnam, and that decision tells you something important about what the church had found there. The older architecture of Old Yharnam, visible beneath the burn damage, tells a story about what the district once was. This was not a slum or an industrial zone. The buildings of Old Yharnam were once as substantial as anything in Central Yharnam. The stone good quality, the construction capable of lasting centuries under normal conditions. The burning did not happen because the district was disposable. It happened despite the district being a genuine part of the city, which means the decision to burn it was more significant and more costly than simply setting fire to something already expendable. Jura, the old hunter who guards Old Yharnam from his rooftop position, is one of the game's most morally complex characters. He is not a villain. He is a man who made a decision that goes against the logic of the hunt. A man who looked at the beasts of Old Yharnam and decided that they had once been people, and still deserved a degree of protection. His hostility to new hunters entering Old Yharnam is not aggression for its own sake. It is the defence of a position he has developed through experience and reflection, a position that the game systems treat as an obstacle, but that the law treats with a great deal of sympathy. Jura's specific history is partially recoverable from the items and dialogue associated with him. He was a hunter who had hunted in Old Yharnam before the burning, possibly during the events that led to the burning, and what he saw there changed his understanding of what the hunt was for. The transformation from person to beast was not a clean categorical boundary, and Jura had seen enough of the process to understand that the thing being hunted was not entirely separate from the people he had once been trying to protect. That recognition had broken the clean logic of the hunt for him, and he had stayed in Old Yharnam to process it, indefinitely, from a rooftop with a Gatling gun. The beasts of Old Yharnam have a specific character that distinguishes them from the beasts of Central Yharnam. They are more fully transformed, further from the human form, in ways that suggest either a more advanced stage of the transformation or a longer period of exposure to whatever caused Old Yharnam's outbreak. They move differently, they react differently, and there is less of the dual-natured quality that makes the Central Yharnam beasts so disturbing. These are further along a process that the Central Yharnam beasts are just beginning. The church building at the centre of Old Yharnam, the one that becomes the arena for the blood-starved beast encounter, was once a place of active ministry. It shows signs of having been a functioning church space, with the familiar architectural elements of the healing church's aesthetic, before whatever happened in Old Yharnam transformed it into the ruined and contaminated space it now occupies. The blood-starved beast itself, inhabiting the innermost space of what was once a religious building, suggests a particular kind of desecration that the church would have found unbearable to look at. The blood-starved beast is thought to be a being that had been subjected to extreme blood ministration under conditions that push the transformation faster than the process usually goes. The location of this creature in the church's own building points toward the possibility that the church was conducting experimental ministry in Old Yharnam, testing the limits of what the old blood could do when applied without the usual restraints. This would fit with the broader history of Old Yharnam as a district where the church was doing something it later decided it needed to burn and seal away. The Pthumerian relics and connections in Old Yharnam are stronger than in many other surface districts. The lower parts of Old Yharnam open into Chalice Dungeon. Access points more directly than most areas, and the items found here suggest that the church's work in Old Yharnam was specifically related to the Pthumerian heritage of the site. Old Yharnam may have been built or rebuilt in a location that had specific significance to the older civilization, and the church's activities there had been partly about exploiting that significance. The fire damage in Old Yharnam is uneven, which tells a story about how the burning was conducted. Some areas are almost completely incinerated, with only the stone framework of buildings remaining. Other areas have survived with more of their structure intact. This unevenness suggests either that the fire spread in ways the church did not fully control, or that the church deliberately preserved certain structures while burning others. The distinction between what was burned completely and what was allowed to survive may reflect specific decisions about what needed to be destroyed and what could be allowed to remain. The church servants who can be found in the lower areas of Old Yharnam, still apparently performing functions connected to the church's work in the district, are deeply unsettling presences. They suggest that the church had not entirely abandoned Old Yharnam even after the burning. Some element of the church's operation had continued in the district's lower reaches, conducted by people who either had not received the order to leave or who had specific reasons to stay. The persistence of church-connected figures in a sealed and burned district points toward the church's relationship with Old Yharnam being more complicated than a simple act of abandonment. The presence of the powder kegs in Old Yharnam is another layer of the district's complex history. The powder kegs were a faction of hunters who had developed fire-based and explosive weapons, who had a philosophical commitment to unconventional hunting methods that put them in conflict with the more traditional factions. Their presence in Old Yharnam suggests an association between this district and the powder kegs that predates the burning, possibly that Old Yharnam was associated with their origin or their early history. Dura's weapons, the tools available from his questline, are products of the powder keg philosophy, tools that cause widespread damage in ways that conventional hunting doctrine would have considered excessive. The Gatling gun he uses to defend the district from his tower is a statement about his approach to the hunt and his relationship with the city below. He is not trying to protect Old Yharnam by hunting carefully within it. He is trying to prevent anyone from entering and disturbing whatever peace the beasts of the district have achieved in the ruins of their former lives. The Old Yharnam church building and the path through it to the blood-starved beast follows a structure that many of the game's mid-game locations use, a path through a corrupted or ruined institutional space that ends in an encounter with the most extreme product of that institution's failures. The blood-starved beast is what the church's ministry in Old Yharnam produced at its most extreme. The path to it is a walk through the evidence of the process that produced it. The ringing bells in Old Yharnam have a different quality than the bells in other parts of the city. They feel older, more embedded in the district's fabric, as if the bell-ringing practice here had been going on long enough to become genuinely ritualistic rather than an emergency response. This suggests that the ritual use of bells in connection with the hunt was not invented by the people using it in Central Yharnam, but had older roots, possibly in the specific history of Old Yharnam and what the church was doing there before the burning. The connection between Old Yharnam and the fishing hamlet, if the larger lore is taken together, is one of the game's most significant geographic relationships, even though it is not physically direct. The events that led to the creation of the Old Blood, that connected the church to the Great Ones, and specifically to the creature from the hamlet, had consequences that eventually produced Old Yharnam. The burning of Old Yharnam was, in a long chain of causation, a consequence of the church's actions at the fishing hamlet. The two locations, separated by vast distances, are chapters in the same story. The atmosphere of Old Yharnam after Jura's Gatling gun is dealt with, or circumvented, has a quality that distinguishes it from the frantic violence of Central Yharnam. Old Yharnam is quieter, in a way that feels less like the absence of threat and more like the aftermath of something that has already been completed. The violence here is done. The burning is done. The beasts are doing what beasts do in the ruins of the place they once called home. There is a terrible stasis to Old Yharnam, a sense that the catastrophe here has already reached its conclusion, and that you are visiting a place that finished becoming what it is long before your arrival. The lower levels of Old Yharnam, near the Chalice dungeon connections, show a different face of the district than the burned upper levels. Down here, the Pthumerian substrate is visible, the old stone that predates the human city, the structures that the church had been excavating and studying. This is the foundation on which Old Yharnam was built, and its survival beneath the burning tells you something about what could and could not be destroyed. The church could burn the surface. The deeper layers were beyond its ability to erase. The note left by a researcher in one of Old Yharnam's buildings, describing the progression of symptoms associated with the beast transformation, is one of the most clinical pieces of writing in the game. It has the quality of a medical document rather than a personal testimony, which says something specific about the culture of observation and documentation that had developed around the plague in this district. Someone was watching the transformation process with enough detachment to take notes, and those notes survived the burning. The clinical tone of the observation is itself a kind of horror, suggesting that the transformation of human beings into monsters had become routine enough to be documented in the language of research. The beasts that cluster around the church building in Old Yharnam, particularly those that seem to be drawn toward the interior space where the blood-starved beast resides, may be exhibiting a behavior that the game encourages you to think about, rather than directly explaining. Are they drawn to the blood-starved beast out of some residual instinct of community, some remnant of the social behavior they had as human beings? Or is there a different kind of attraction at work, something about the blood-starved beast's more advanced state that other beasts respond to, as though it represents something they are all moving toward? The lore doesn't say, but the behavior is observable. The physical layout of Old Yharnam, with its rooftop paths and the constant presence of Jura's tower in the background, creates a specific navigational experience that mirrors the district's narrative role. You are never entirely free of the threat from above, the possibility that the guardian of this place will punish your intrusion. And Jura's tower is always visible, always pointing toward the figure who has made a different kind of peace with Old Yharnam than the church or the conventional hunters have managed. The tower is a conscience in the landscape. The relationship between Old Yharnam and the concept of containment is one of the district's central themes. The church contained Old Yharnam with fire and walls. Jura contains his grief with distance and purpose, guarding what he cannot save. The blood-starved beast is contained within the church building by its own nature, its hunger constrained by the walls. Old Yharnam is full of different kinds of enclosure, different strategies for dealing with something that cannot be healed and cannot be fully destroyed. The specific items dropped by enemies in Old Yharnam suggest that the residents of the district before the burning had access to blood ministration at a higher level or in a different form than the residents of Central Yharnam. The quality of the blood-related items found here points toward experimental ministry, toward the church testing applications of the old blood that went beyond ordinary healing. This is consistent with the idea that Old Yharnam was a site of advanced church research, and that the outbreak here was at least partly a result of that research exceeding what the church could manage. The way Old Yharnam is physically positioned relative to Central Yharnam, below and to the side, connected but separated, reflects its narrative relationship to the rest of the game. It is adjacent to the main story, but offset from it, a parallel history that informs the present without being the present. You do not need to understand Old Yharnam to complete the game, but you do need it to understand why Yharnam is what it is. It is the context that the main story assumes, without explaining. The Church's decision to burn Old Yharnam rather than to continue attempting to manage or cure the outbreak reveals something about the limits of the Church's confidence in its own methods. The Church believed in the old blood deeply enough to make it the foundation of Yharnam's identity and economy. But when the old blood produced something in Old Yharnam that the Church could not handle, the Church did not redouble its faith, it lit the fire. That pragmatism in the face of theological commitment is one of the more human things the Church ever did, and one of the more terrible. The child who may have been Lawrence before his rise to prominence within the Church is connected, in the law's more speculative threads, to Old Yharnam. If Lawrence's understanding of the beast plague was shaped by direct experience with Old Yharnam, then the decisions he made as first vicar about how to manage the old blood were informed by watching it fail catastrophically up close. The burning may have been his decision, his solution to a problem he had observed from within. That would make Old Yharnam not just a Church catastrophe, but a personal one, for the man who would go on to define the Church's direction for everything that followed. The acoustic properties of Old Yharnam are different from other districts, because the burning had altered the physical structure of the buildings in ways that changed how sound moved through the space. Sound behaviour is one of those environmental details that players absorb without necessarily analysing, but it contributes to the specific feeling of being in a place that has been fundamentally changed, where the normal rules of the environment no longer apply in the ways you expect. The fog in Old Yharnam is thicker than in Central Yharnam, which may have multiple causes. The burning itself would have left a residue in the air that combined with the district's geography to produce a heavier atmospheric quality. But the fog in Old Yharnam also has the quality of something that is not entirely natural, the same uncanny quality that the fog in other parts of Yharnam has, suggesting that whatever had made the district's plague so extreme had also intensified the more atmospheric manifestations of the larger strangeness that surrounds the city. The way Old Yharnam ends with the connection to the Pthumerian chalice dungeons opening up below is architecturally and narratively significant. The district does not simply terminate at its lowest visible point. It descends further into the labyrinthine older structures below. This means that Old Yharnam, which presented itself to the Church as a problem that could be sealed and burned and contained, was actually an opening, a gateway, and sealing the surface only prevented access from above. What was below the surface was never sealed at all. The Church's legacy in Old Yharnam is visible in everything the district has become. The burned buildings are church buildings, or buildings built in the shadow of the Church. The beasts were people who received church ministration. The rituals that the bell ringers perform are corrupted church rituals. The sealed entry points are church constructions. Old Yharnam is the Church's most complete creation, in the sense that the Church is responsible for every significant element of what it is. Acknowledging Old Yharnam honestly would require acknowledging that the Church made it. Jura does not leave Old Yharnam. Even if you complete his questline peacefully, he remains in his tower, watching over the district. He has no plan for what comes next. He is simply present, refusing to participate in the logic that produced Old Yharnam, while also unable to undo it. His continued presence is one of the game's most honest statements about the limits of moral clarity. Knowing that something was wrong does not give you the power to make it right. Sometimes you just stay and watch and refuse to pretend it was anything other than what it was. Old Yharnam is the game's explicit reminder that the present crisis is not the first. Yharnam has done this before. The Church has sealed this before. The cycle has turned before, and the response to the previous turn was fire and silence. Whether the current turn will end differently is a question that Old Yharnam exists to make you uncertain about. The district's burned silence is an argument about inevitability, about the limits of human responses to forces that humans initiated but cannot fully control. The final quality of Old Yharnam that stays with you as you leave through the lower passages is its completeness as a tragedy. It is not an ongoing catastrophe like Central Yharnam, it is a concluded one. The people of Old Yharnam have been beasts for long enough that the category of their former humanity is almost entirely academic. The church burned the evidence of what they were. Jura remembers it. Nobody else is left to witness. Old Yharnam is history, and like all history, it is inert in the most terrible possible way, unable to change itself, able only to be walked through by people who may or may not understand what they're seeing. Chapter 4. Hemwick Charnel Lane. Hemwick Charnel Lane is not a district that the game requires you to visit, and that optional quality is part of what makes it interesting to spend time with. It is a road essentially, a path through an agricultural and industrial area outside the main city, a place where the ordinary infrastructure of death and disposal that any large settlement requires was located out of sight of the people who relied on it. Hemwick handled bodies. It processed the dead, the executed, the unclaimed. Before the hunt, it would have been an unremarkable and unpleasant place to live and work. The hunt made it something significantly more complicated. The charnel lane itself, the road that gives the area its name, is a path that would have been travelled by carts and workers rather than citizens. This was a working-class district in the most literal sense, a place where the work that keeps civilization running, but that civilization prefers not to think about, was conducted. The stone walls of the lane, built to channel workers and deliveries rather than to impress anyone, have the honest quality of infrastructure. They were not built to look like anything. They were built to last, which they have. The grave women of Hemwick are the area's primary enemy type, and they tell a specific story about the district. These are women who worked with the dead, who handled and processed bodies as their livelihood, and who have been transformed into something that now works with body parts in a different and more disturbing way. The grave women collect eyeballs. They are associated with a specific kind of acquisition that connects Hemwick to the larger lore about insight and perception. That connection to vision, to the acquisition of the perceptual equipment that the Great Ones prize, is the key to understanding what Hemwick actually was. The Witch of Hemwick encounters, the two bosses that occupy a specific chamber in the area's interior, point towards something having been present in Hemwick before the hunt, something that had established a relationship with the district's workers and the materials they handled. The witches are not beasts in the conventional sense. They are something older and more deliberate, entities that have been using the grave women and their area's resources for purposes that the lore only partially illuminates. The connection between the witches and the old blood is indirect, but the connection between the witches and the kind of perception-related research the church was pursuing is more direct. The specific geography of Hemwick, outside the city walls but connected to them, reflects the district's social position. It was necessary to Yharnam, but kept separate from it. The corpse disposal infrastructure, the graveyards, the charnel processes were located here, specifically because the city wanted those functions performed at a distance. This physical separation also meant that Hemwick developed somewhat independently of the church's direct oversight, which may explain why practices that were not strictly church-approved had taken root in the district without attracting intervention. The connection between Hemwick and the Canehurst summons is one of the area's most significant geographic details. The Canehurst summons, the invitation that allows the player to visit the ruined castle of the aristocratic Vilebloods, is found in Hemwick. This placement suggests a historical connection between Hemwick and Canehurst that the game mentions only in passing. Perhaps Canehurst had relationships with the charnel workers that the church did not. Perhaps the Vilebloods' own relationship with blood made them interested in the people who worked most closely with human remains. Whatever the specific history, the physical fact of the summons being in Hemwick is a deliberate connection. The eyeballs collected by the grave women point toward a specific relationship between perception, death, and the kind of knowledge the game associates with insight. The act of seeing, the capacity to perceive the great ones, and the deeper reality they represent, is tied throughout the game to physical eyes in ways that are taken literally rather than metaphorically. The grave women collecting eyeballs are therefore participating, however unwittingly, in an economy of perception, collecting the material substrate of sight from the dead bodies of people who had seen what they had seen and could no longer use those organs. The architecture of Hemwick's buildings is humbler than anything in Central Yharnam or the Cathedral Ward. These are buildings built for function, for storage, for the practical requirements of working with bodies. The lack of pretension in the architecture is itself a statement about the people who lived and worked here, people who are not part of the city's self-image, who occupied the gap between Yharnam's aspirations and its material reality. The church healed the living. Hemwick handled what was left when the healing failed. The fog in Hemwick has a quality that is specific to this area. It is thicker in some places than others, in a way that does not follow the geography in any obvious way. This could be a purely atmospheric effect, the combination of the area's proximity to the coast and its specific elevation. But in the context of the game's larger lore, the fog in Hemwick points toward the witches, toward entities that had been present in the area long enough to affect its physical environment, to make the fog respond to their presence in ways that ordinary atmospheric conditions cannot fully explain. The graves throughout Hemwick Charnel Lane are more varied than the graves in other parts of Yharnam. They range from very simple markers to more elaborate structures, and their variety suggests that Hemwick had been handling the dead from different social classes, from different periods, for a long time. There are graves here that look genuinely old, predating the current version of Yharnam, markers of people who died before the church arrived and reshaped the city's relationship with death and healing. These older graves are part of the deeper stratigraphy of the area, a reminder that Hemwick's relationship with the dead preceded the church's interest in the old blood. The Witch of Hemwick bosses, despite their menacing nature, are ultimately not the most threatening thing in the area in the way that major bosses usually establish their dominance. They are dangerous, but their danger has a quality of age and patience rather than aggression and hunger. These are beings that have been doing something for a very long time, that have a specific agenda that predates the current hunt night and will presumably continue after it if they survive. The encounter feels less like a fight against a monster and more like an interruption of a process that was already underway. The specific rewards associated with the witch encounter, the rune that grants additional carry capacity for certain items, suggests that the witches had accumulated something, had collected something, had been filling something over time. The rune associated with them is about storage, about the capacity to hold more than you would ordinarily be able to carry. This points toward the witches' activity in Hemwick having been an accumulation project, a long-term collection of something that the area's function as a charnel district made particularly available. The Hemwick workers who have been transformed, the versions of the grave women who are at various stages of the process, tell a story about how the plague moved through a specific kind of community. The grave women were, before the plague, people with a specific relationship to death that was professional and daily. They had been desensitized to death in ways that most people were not. When the plague arrived, that desensitization had a specific effect on how the transformation process played out for them. The horror that might have arrested the process in someone else was not available to people who handled the dead as a matter of routine. The lanterns of Hemwick are fewer than in the main city districts, and their placement reflects the area's more isolated and peripheral status. The Hunter's Dream network had not extended as fully into Hemwick as it had into the central districts, which suggests that official hunters had not historically spent much time in the area. The lane had managed its own affairs, for better and worse, without the sustained attention of the hunt's formal infrastructure. That independence had allowed certain practices to establish themselves there without interference. The crows of Hemwick are different from the crows of Central Yharnam in the way they occupy the space. They are less frantic, more settled, as if they have been here longer and have established a specific relationship with the area's particular kind of death. These birds have been feeding in Hemwick for a long time, longer than the current outbreak, and their comfort in the space reflects the district's long history of providing what they need. They are not responding to an emergency. They are in their natural environment. The architectural transition between the open road of the charnel lane and the more enclosed internal spaces of the district's buildings reflects the way the area moves between public and private. The lane itself was a public thoroughfare, used by workers and deliveries in daylight. The interior spaces, the buildings where the actual processing happened, were not public. The transition into those interior spaces in the game is a transition into a more private and more disturbing world, the working spaces of an industry that preferred not to be watched. The specific types of body bags and storage vessels visible throughout Hemwick suggest a level of organisation that predates the current crisis. Hemwick was not doing its work casually. It had systems, processes, ways of tracking what came in and what was done with it. The organisational infrastructure of the charnel district, still partially visible in the arrangement of its spaces and the placement of its equipment, points toward a workforce that had developed expertise over generations, that had refined the mechanics of its grim trade to the point of genuine professionalism. The presence of certain research-related items in the more concealed spaces of Hemwick points toward the area having attracted church interest, specifically because of what it was. A district that handled bodies with professionalism and discretion was useful to a church conducting research on the old blood's effects. The church's researchers needed access to remains in various stages of transformation, needed access to bodies that had been subjected to experimental ministration, and Hemwick could provide that access without the inconvenient public visibility that the same work would have attracted in the cathedral ward. The path through Hemwick that leads to the optional witch encounter requires a degree of exploration that the game does not explicitly reward with narrative prominence. This positioning of Hemwick as an optional and somewhat hidden piece of the game's larger story mirrors its social position in Yharnam's geography. It was there all along, doing necessary work, but not featured in the main story because it was not part of the main story's self-presentation. The charnel district was where Yharnam put the things it needed to not see. The relationship between Hemwick and the moon in the game's larger lore is suggested by the area's atmosphere and the specific quality of light that filters through the fog during the hunt night. The moon in Bloodborne is not an ordinary moon. It is something that has been changed, or that changes during specific conditions, and its influence on the beasts and on the people, who have absorbed enough of the old blood to be sensitive to it, is a recurring lore thread. Hemwick, positioned outside the city, with less shelter from the sky, seems more directly exposed to whatever the moon is doing during the hunt night than the enclosed urban spaces of Central Yharnam or the cathedral ward. The blood pools that collect in the lower parts of Hemwick, particularly near the more enclosed charnel buildings, have a specific quality that distinguishes them from the blood in the upper city. This blood is old, in some cases, genuinely old, in a way that the fresh blood of the current hunt night is not. Hemwick has been accumulating the physical residue of its work for a very long time, and the ground here is saturated with it. That saturation points toward the deep roots of the place, toward a history of death and transformation, and the complex relationship between those processes that extends back far beyond the current outbreak. The way Hemwick connects back to the main game, the path that circles back toward the cathedral ward approach from a different angle, gives the area a circular quality that reflects the game's broader spatial philosophy. Bloodborne's world tends to fold back on itself, to create connections between areas that reveal that the city is more compact and more interconnected than it first appeared. Hemwick's circular connection is a geographic statement about the relationship between the charnel district and the main city, separate but connected, held at a distance but fundamentally part of the same system. The Hemwick charnel lane ends with the witch encounter and then opens back into the broader world, and that opening reflects the area's narrative function. Hemwick is not a destination in itself. It is a context, a location that tells you something about the world it exists in, rather than driving a story of its own forward. The grave women and the witches, and the eyeball economy, and the charnel infrastructure are all details that illuminate the main story from a peripheral angle, adding depth by showing you what the edges of Yharnam look like, and suggesting that the centre you've been exploring is embedded in a larger and stranger world than it sometimes appears. The final image of Hemwick Charnel Lane, as you leave it, is of a road that continues. The lane extends further than you have travelled, into fog, toward destinations that the game does not take you to. That continuation suggests that Yharnam's relationship with the charnel function extends further than the single lane the game maps. The charnel district is larger than what you see. The work was extensive, the accumulation was substantial, and somewhere in the fog, along that road, the work continues, unmapped and unattended in the darkness. Chapter 5. Forbidden Woods. The Forbidden Woods are not forbidden in the sense of being dangerous, though they are that. They are forbidden in the sense that the church decided some of what was happening in those woods was not something the public needed to know about, and the church's decision to restrict access to the area was a decision about the management of information rather than the management of a threat. The woods had become associated with practices and communities and histories that the church found inconvenient, and the most efficient solution to inconvenient histories has always been to limit who can get near them. The approach to the Forbidden Woods, through the gate that opens with the password found in the Grand Cathedral, is one of the game's most deliberate threshold experiences. The gate is heavy and old, and the passage through it carries the quality of crossing into a different kind of space. The woods on the other side are quieter than the city, but the quietness is not peaceful. It is the quietness of a place that has learned to be still because movement attracts attention. The woods are watchful, and the things watching are not entirely friendly. The snake enemies of the Forbidden Woods are one of the area's most immediately striking elements, but what the snakes suggest about the lore is more interesting than the challenge they present. Snakes in the game's symbolic vocabulary are associated with a specific kind of corruption, not the beast corruption of the old blood, but something different, something older, something that the game connects to the Pithumerian heritage and to specific great ones, whose influence manifests in serpentine forms. The presence of snake-based creatures in the Forbidden Woods points toward the area having a different history from the city, a history connected to the older substrate beneath Yharnam's more recent conflicts. The village hidden in the Forbidden Woods is one of the game's most important environmental revelations. This is a community that has been living in the woods, apparently, for a long time, with a relationship to the church and the city that the game presents as ambiguous and troubling. The villagers are not church servants, they are not hunters, they are people who have developed their own relationship with whatever is in the woods, their own practices, their own adaptations to living adjacent to whatever the church was doing in the forest and whatever was in the forest before the church became interested in it. The villagers who attack on sight are not simply feral, not simply people who have been driven mad by the beast plague in the way that the Central Yharnam residents have been. They have a quality of intentionality that suggests a different kind of corruption, a different relationship with the substances and entities that the woods contain. Some of them show signs of the snake influence. the presence of serpentine elements in their transformation. Their hostility is not the desperate violence of someone losing control. It feels more like the defensive aggression of a community protecting something specific. The livestock pens and agricultural equipment in the village point toward a community that had been self-sufficient, that had managed to sustain itself in the woods without regular access to the city's infrastructure. This self-sufficiency suggests a long period of separation from the city, long enough for the village to develop its own food systems and its own ways of managing. The church's control of access to the woods would have accelerated this separation, making the village increasingly independent of, and perhaps increasingly hostile to the city it was excluded from. The snakes that infest certain buildings in the village create a specific kind of horror that is different from the beast encounters in the city. These are not people transforming into monsters. These are people who have been colonized from within, whose bodies have been occupied and repurposed. The snakes that emerge from human hosts are taking something that was a person and using it as a vehicle, and that use is not the same as transformation. It is something closer to possession, to the body being maintained as a functional form, while the person who inhabited it is displaced or consumed. The church emissary hidden in the woods, if you find the connected lore threads, suggests that the church had active operations in the area, was conducting specific work in the woods under conditions of concealment, and was doing so with a degree of authorization that came from high within the church hierarchy. The church knew what was in the Forbidden Woods. It had put some of what was in the Forbidden Woods there. The restriction on public access was not just about protecting citizens from danger. It was about protecting the church's operations from public knowledge. The path through the Forbidden Woods that leads to the Byrgenwerth campus is the area's most significant navigational connection. Byrgenwerth is the original site of the church's scholarship, the place where the old hunters and the first scholars made the discoveries that led to everything that followed. The Forbidden Woods sits between Byrgenwerth and the rest of Yharnam, which means the woods functioned as a physical buffer between the institution where the church's terrible knowledge originated and the city that had been built on the application of that knowledge. You cannot reach the source without passing through the consequences. The Forbidden Woods as a geographic concept within the game's world suggests that Yharnam had other spaces like this, other areas where the church had restricted access because of what was happening there, other communities and operations hidden from the public view of the city. The woods is the one the game takes you through, but the logic of the church's behaviour points toward a pattern rather than a single instance. The Healing Church was very good at managing the information landscape of the city it operated in, and the Forbidden Woods is one of its most explicit tools. The specific quality of the trees in the area, the way they have grown, and how they have been affected by whatever is in the soil and the air of the woods, points toward the ground being saturated with something that the trees have absorbed over time. The old blood and the Thumerian residue and whatever the church's research has introduced into the environment have had an effect on the living things that grow in the woods, an effect that is visible but not immediately legible. The forest remembers in its own way what has been done in it. The shotgun-carrying church servants found in the deeper parts of the woods are a confirmation that the church maintained an active presence here. These are not abandoned personnel. They are operational, conducting what appears to be ongoing maintenance of the church's activities in the area. Their presence in the woods, armed and apparently still following some kind of protocol, suggests that the church's work in the Forbidden Woods had not been interrupted by the Hunt Night, in the way that most of the church's surface operations had been. Something in the woods had continued. The cave systems that run through the Forbidden Woods area connect the surface forest to the deeper geological structures, to the aqueducts and channels that move water and perhaps other substances through the landscape beneath Yharnam. These connections mean that the Forbidden Woods is not isolated from the city's infrastructure in the way its apparent separation would suggest. It is connected, underground, to the same systems that run beneath Central Yharnam and the Cathedral Ward. The restriction on surface access to the woods had never prevented underground connection. The presence of the shadows of Yharnam in the woods, if encountered in the appropriate context, points toward a different kind of power operating in the area, one connected to the Vilebloods and the Canehurst aristocracy, rather than to the healing church. The rivalry between Canehurst and the church had geographic expressions, and the Forbidden Woods, positioned between the city and the directions from which Canehurst influence flowed, would have been a contested zone in that rivalry. Different forces had interests in the woods, and those interests did not always align. The descent through the Forbidden Woods toward the lower areas, toward the paths that lead to Byrgenwerth and beyond, is one of the game's more extended and meditative journey sections. The woods are long and winding, full of things that want to kill you, but they are also full of the ambient evidence of what the area once was and what it is becoming. You are walking through a transition zone, a space between the human city and the older, stranger spaces that the human city was built to access and exploit. The woods is where the transition becomes visible. The ladder that takes you from the higher parts of the woods to the lower village, and then the passage that connects the village to the path toward the coast and Byrgenwerth, creates a specific spatial narrative of descent and approach. You come from the church district, you pass through the controlled wildness of the upper woods, you encounter the village and its strange inhabitants, and then you follow a path down toward the coast, where the oldest and most significant sources of the church's troubles are located. The Forbidden Woods is the middle chapter of that descent. The oil urns and firepots scattered through the woods suggest that someone, at some point, had been preparing to use fire in the area in the same way that fire is used in Yharnam streets. The forest had been considered a potential site of the kind of controlled burning that the church used to manage outbreaks. Whether that burning ever happened, whether the Forbidden Woods had its own old Yharnam moment that is not as thoroughly documented as the cities, is a question the environment raises without answering. The presence of the fire preparation materials suggests the church had considered the option. The wildlife of the Forbidden Woods, beyond the snakes and the transformed enemies, includes creatures that seem to have been present before the plague, before the church's intervention, before the human settlement of the area. These are older inhabitants of the woods, things that live in forests rather than in cities or their satellites, and their presence suggests that the woods was a genuinely wild space before it was turned into a restricted zone. The wildness was there before the restriction, and some of it has persisted despite everything the human world has done to the land around it. The fog in the Forbidden Woods is specific to the forest in a way that differs from the city fog. It settles into the lowest parts of the terrain, filling the valleys and the depressions in the ground, leaving the higher paths clearer. This creates a specific navigational challenge, but also a visual experience of moving above and through layers of obscured ground. What is in the low fog of the Forbidden Woods is not always what you expect when it becomes visible. The Forbidden Woods' connection to the main game, as a necessary passage, rather than an optional area, gives it a different narrative weight than Hemwick. You have to go through here. The church's restriction of access to these woods is not something you can respect and still progress through the game. You have to open that gate, you have to walk through the restriction, and in doing so, you participate in the game's central gesture. The refusal to let the church's information management stand between you and the truth. The village in the woods, considered as a human settlement that developed outside the church's direct control, points toward the possibility that there were other ways of living in proximity to the old blood, other adaptations, other outcomes than the ones the church managed in the city. The village is not a success story. Its inhabitants have been transformed in disturbing ways, but the transformation is different, and the difference suggests that the specific form the plague took in Yharnam was shaped by the church's interventions as much as by the old blood's intrinsic properties. Different exposure produced different results. The exit from the Forbidden Woods, the passage that opens onto the area near Byrgenwerth and the lake, is one of those moments in the game where the world suddenly becomes larger than you expected. The woods had been enclosed and claustrophobic for most of their length, with the trees and the terrain limiting the view. Emerging from them onto the open ground near the school and the lake is a spatial and narrative revelation. You have arrived at a place that the entire structure of the game's world had been pointing toward, a place that the woods had been protecting, intentionally or otherwise, with all their complications and their dangers. What is here at the end of the woods is worth thinking about carefully. The final quality of the Forbidden Woods that the lore rewards attention to is their role as a liminal space, a threshold that has been made difficult to cross for reasons that are partly practical and partly symbolic. You cannot go from the church's city to the church's origins without travelling through a space that shows you what the church's knowledge has done to the world it passed through. The woods are the evidence between the institution and its source, and you have to walk through that evidence to understand either. Chapter 6. Byrgenwerth. Byrgenwerth is where it started. Whatever else you might say about the lore of Bloodborne, whatever the complexities and the factions and the centuries of institutional development, the specific chain of events that produced Yharnam as you experience it began here, in this scholastic institution set at the edge of a lake, looking out at the water where something older than human memory had once made contact with the first people who were willing to receive it. Byrgenwerth is the origin point, and origin points in Bloodborne tend to be terrible. The school itself is now abandoned, but the quality of the abandonment is important. Byrgenwerth was not destroyed. It was not burned like old Yharnam, not sealed like the Forbidden Woods passages, not converted to a different purpose like many of the church's other properties. It was simply vacated, left with its books and its instruments and its institutional memory intact, as if whoever left expected to come back, and then did not. The school of a civilization that overreached tends to look like this, complete and quiet, everything in its place, the lesson plans still on the desks, the teachers simply absent. Master Willem, who you find at Byrgenwerth in a state that the game renders with terrible compassion, represents the end point of the school's original scholarly project. He was the head of the institution, the intellectual architect of the research program that discovered the Thumerian ruins and began the excavation of the old blood significance. His current condition, seated in a chair at the edge of the lake, his mind barely present, points toward what the pursuit of knowledge of this specific kind eventually does to the people who pursue it most deeply. He got what he was looking for. The cost is sitting in that chair. The scholarly philosophy of Byrgenwerth, insofar as it can be reconstructed from the items and fragments left in the school, points toward an intellectual tradition that valued direct experience of the sublime over the accumulated wisdom of previous generations. The scholars of Byrgenwerth were not content to study the old blood at a remove, to develop theories about what it was and what it did. They wanted to encounter the reality of it directly, to absorb enough of its qualities to understand it from within. This is a recognizable intellectual position. It is also in context a catastrophically dangerous one. The split between Willem and Lawrence, which led to the founding of the Healing Church as a separate institution, is one of the defining events in the game's backstory, and its traces are visible throughout Byrgenwerth. Willem wanted something, and Lawrence wanted something different, and the institution that had contained both of them was not large enough to hold both visions. Lawrence took the old blood out of the school and into the world, turning the scholar's discovery into the church's product. Willem stayed with the original vision, pushing further into the experiential research that Lawrence had apparently found too extreme. The specific nature of Willem's research, the question of eyes on the inside, The project of developing the capacity for a different kind of perception through the accumulation of insight is the theoretical heart of Bjergenwerth's later phase. After Lawrence left, Willem and the remaining scholars were not constrained by the need to make the old blood useful to ordinary people. They could pursue the pure question, what happens if you keep going? If you accept every increment of transformation? If you follow the old blood's logic to its natural conclusion? The answer is visible in Willem's condition. The lake behind Bjergenwerth contains the Rome encounter, and the placement of this boss in the most immediate geographic context of the school's original research is significant. Rome is a great one, or something close to one, a being of considerable power that specifically maintains certain illusions about the state of the world. The fact that Rome is here at Bjergenwerth suggests a connection between the school's research and this specific entity, a connection that had either been a goal of the research or an outcome of it. Something in Bjergenwerth's work had produced or attracted or maintained a relationship with a being that kept certain truths hidden. The spider form of the Rom encounter, the enormous and distressing body plan, points toward a specific transformation that Bjergenwerth's research pursued when it diverged from the beast transformation that affected the blood-using population of Yharnam. The spiders are not beasts, they are something else, a different direction of transformation, a different outcome of the old blood's potential depending on how it is used and how deeply. The school had found a road that led somewhere other than beasthood, and what it led to was this. The books and research materials that remain in Bjergenwerth, while not comprehensively legible as a narrative, create a portrait of an academic culture that had been extremely productive in its time. These were serious scholars. The institutional infrastructure of the school, the library, the research spaces, the administrative offices, the accommodation for long-term residents, all of it points toward an institution that was genuinely doing intellectual work rather than using scholarly form as a cover for something else. The tragedy of Bjergenwerth is not that it was corrupt, it is that it was sincere. The spider enemies encountered in and around Bjergenwerth are a more benign version of the transformation that Rom represents, and their presence throughout the area creates a visual argument for a specific origin. These are people who attended the school, who participated in the research, who underwent the experiences that Willem's philosophy prescribed, and who have been changed by those experiences in ways that are now permanent. Bjergenwerth is surrounded by the results of its own intellectual program. The specific items found in Bjergenwerth, the rune workshop tool, the tools that allow you to read and use runes, are an important piece of the school's legacy. The rune system that the game uses for player equipment modifications is a Bjergenwerth discovery, an attempt to translate the language of the Great Ones into a form that human beings could use. The fact that this translation is possible, that the language of the Great Ones can be written and read and applied, points toward the school having made a genuine breakthrough in understanding the nature of the entities they were studying. The approach to Bjergenwerth across the narrow path from the Forbidden Woods, with the lake visible and the building's silhouette against the sky, is one of the game's most atmospheric approaches to a major location. The school looks almost peaceful from a distance, a quiet academic building at the edge of a quiet lake. The gap between that appearance and the reality of what you encounter inside is carefully managed by the game's pacing, and that management points toward Bjergenwerth's double nature. It was always presenting one face to the outside world and conducting different business within. The clock in Bjergenwerth, if there is one, has stopped in the sense that the institution's time is over. Willem's condition means the school's active research has concluded in the only way it could conclude, given the direction it took. But the school's legacy has not stopped. Everything that happened after Bjergenwerth, the church, the hunt, the night you are participating in, is an ongoing consequence of what was started here. The school has stopped, but the experiment continues, in the streets and the dreams of the city it created. The relationship between Byrgenwerth and the fishing hamlet, recoverable from the DLC, is the key to understanding what the school's original discovery actually was. The scholars of Byrgenwerth did not discover the old blood by accident. They followed leads, they pursued a specific type of information, and eventually they arrived at a coast where a specific community had a specific relationship with a specific Great One that had washed up there. What they did in that community is one of the darkest chapters in the game's lore. What they took from it is what the entire church was subsequently built on. The moon presence and its connection to Byrgenwerth is one of the game's most carefully kept mysteries, but the physical proximity of Byrgenwerth to the lake, where the moon presence's influence is strongest, points toward the school having been in contact with this entity, possibly as a goal of their research, possibly as an outcome they did not anticipate. The moon presence is the entity that sustains the hunter's dream, and if Byrgenwerth is the origin point of the hunt's formal existence, then the connection between the school and this entity is foundational to everything. The fog lake, the specific environmental quality of the water around the Rom encounter, is different from any other water in the game. It has a quality of depth that is not purely physical, a sense that what is beneath the surface is not ordinary lake bottom, but something else, something that extends further than a lake should extend, something that the Rom encounter is positioned at the threshold of. Byrgenwerth was built next to this lake deliberately, and that deliberateness suggests the school had a reason to maintain proximity to whatever the lake contained. The windows of Byrgenwerth face the lake in a way that suggests the scholars spent a great deal of time looking at the water. This is an architectural choice, the placement of the most important windows in the most important rooms to look toward a specific direction, and that choice tells you something about what the school considered most significant in its environment. The scholars were watching the lake. They were waiting for something to emerge from it, or they were trying to understand something that was already there. Willem's final gesture, if you approach him correctly, pointing with a cane toward a message on the ground, is the school's last communication. It is not a warning in the conventional sense. It is something more like a direction, a pointing towards something specific, a final insistence on the value of looking and seeing and not looking away. Whatever Willem became in his years of research, whatever the cost of his pursuit was, he retained enough of the scholarly impulse to point toward the next step for whoever came after him. That impulse, in the ruins of everything his school built and destroyed, is both touching and devastating. The Byrgenwerth rooftop, accessible with some navigation, gives a view of the lake and the surrounding area that puts the school's position in its landscape into perspective. The school is not large. It is a modest institution by any objective measure. A cluster of buildings at the edge of a body of water, with the woods behind it and the coast visible in the distance. The scale of what was produced here, the institutions, the theology, the blood economy of an entire city, the hunt that has been running for generations, is completely disproportionate to the physical size of the place where it began. Byrgenwerth is proof that the most consequential things do not require large spaces. They require only a specific question asked by the wrong people in the wrong place. The school's library contains books that describe the Thumerian ruins and the process by which the scholars first understood what the ruins represented. These accounts, fragmentary and incomplete, point toward the school having approached its discoveries with genuine scholarly rigour before the implications of those discoveries transformed the scholarly enterprise into something else. The early Byrgenwerth was a real institution conducting real research. The point at which the research exceeded the institution's ethical framework is not marked by a single event but by a gradual drift, a series of decisions each of which seemed defensible in isolation and which in aggregate produced something monstrous. The connection between Byrgenwerth and the Great One, called the Eye, or the connection to the concept of eyes and perception that runs through the school's entire research program, is the thread that connects the school to the choir, to the orphanage, to Hemwick's eyeball collecting, grave women, to Willem's condition, to every aspect of the game that involves the relationship between seeing and knowing. Byrgenwerth decided that the path to transcendence ran through perception, through the accumulation of the capacity to see more and more. That decision and its consequences structured the entire world the game takes place in. The ROM encounter, when it finally happens, is the moment when Byrgenwerth's most fundamental secret becomes the player's problem in a direct and physical way. ROM has been maintaining something, has been keeping certain truths from being visible, and the fight with ROM is therefore not just a boss encounter, but an epistemological crisis, a moment where the game's world changes in response to a new level of knowledge becoming available. That the fight happens in the lake behind Byrgenwerth connects the revelation to the school that first made contact with the truths that ROM has been hiding. The ending of Byrgenwerth's story, as recoverable from the lore, is a story about the difference between knowledge and wisdom, between knowing what is true and knowing what to do with what is true. The scholars of Byrgenwerth knew things that very few human beings have ever known. They understood the nature of the Great Ones, the deep history of the Thumerians, the properties of the old blood, the language of entities whose mode of existence is completely different from human existence. They had more genuine knowledge of these things than anyone in the game's world, and they used it to produce Willem sitting in a chair and Rom sitting in a lake, and a city full of people who lost their minds trying to follow where the school pointed. Chapter 7. Yahar'gul, the Unseen Village. Yahar'gul is a place that the game hides from you, initially. You find hints of it, passages that might lead there, a sense that there is a district of the city that you have not yet been able to access properly. And then the Yahar'gul abductors take you, and you arrive not from a door you opened, but in a cage you did not choose. And the entry into the village tells you something important about the village's nature before you have seen any of it. You come to Yahar'gul because the village wanted you there. The school of Mensis had its operations in Yahar'gul, and the school's specific character, its relationship to the hierarchy and to the Great Ones, its willingness to pursue methods that other factions found excessive, is visible throughout the village's architecture and its population. The school of Mensis was not an ordinary academic institution in the way that Byrgenwerth had been. It was an operational organisation, a faction within the church that had developed a specific agenda and was actively executing it. Yahar'gul was where that execution happened. The One Reborn, the boss encountered in Yahar'gul, is one of the game's most viscerally disturbing creations, but its lore significance goes beyond shock value. The One Reborn represents a specific aspiration of the school of Mensis, an attempt to create something that could serve as a vessel or a surrogate for the kind of contact with the Great Ones that the school was pursuing. The pile of bodies, the fused mass of human remains, is not an accident or a pure expression of madness. It is a designed thing, a product of a specific research agenda with specific goals. The abductors of Yahar'gul, the large bag-carrying creatures that take players who die in certain areas and deposit them in a cage in the village, are one of the game's most unusual and effective mechanical moments of environmental storytelling. They are conducting an operation, they are collecting something. The players they take are incidental to what they are actually after, which is human beings, human bodies, human presence. The collection operation tells you that Yahar'gul needed people, that the school of Mensis required a supply of human subjects for the work it was doing. The village architecture of Yahar'gul is dense and layered in a way that suggests it had once been a functional district of the city, a place where people lived and worked before the school of Mensis established its presence and began using the space for purposes that gradually displaced the original population. The bones of an ordinary neighbourhood are still visible in the layout, the residential buildings, the street connections, the arrangement of public and private space. The school had not built Yahargul from scratch. It had occupied an existing place and transformed it. The bell-ringing women of Yahargul, if the context of the village is taken into account, have a specific relationship to the school's operations. The ritual of bell ringing, which in other contexts seems like a corruption of church practice, is in Yahargul something that the school had actively cultivated, a tool for calling and maintaining specific presences in the village. The school understood enough about the bell ringing ritual to use it deliberately, which points toward the ritual having origins in the more theoretical work of institutions like Bjergenwerth, and having been identified and operationalized by the School of Mensis as a practical instrument. The upper areas of Yahargul, accessible after defeating the Unseen Village's challenges, reveal a different layer of the district's purpose. The presence of specific enemies and the quality of the environment in the higher areas suggests that the school's most advanced work was conducted above ground level, in spaces that had access to the sky and to the moon's influence in ways that the lower village streets did not. The moon's significance to the School of Mensis is central to the lore, and the school's facility in Yahargul had been designed, at least in part, to optimize contact with whatever the moon represented in the school's theological framework. The amygdalae that are visible in Yahargul, in large numbers compared to other districts, point toward the village having a specific relationship with these entities, a relationship that the School of Mensis had cultivated or attracted or simply made more visible through the concentration of insight that the school's activities had produced. The village is haunted by these enormous creatures in a way that goes beyond what is visible in the cathedral ward, suggesting that the school's work had intensified the presence of the Great One's servants in the area. The specific items found in Yahargul suggest a research program that had moved significantly beyond what the church's official scholarship was pursuing. The school had developed tools and methods that were not on the curriculum of any official institution, products of an agenda that the church leadership may not have fully endorsed, operating in a district that the church had apparently allowed to become the school's effective independent territory. Yahargul's semi-independence from the church's direct oversight was part of what made the school's work there possible. The moon presence's connection to Yahargul is one of the game's most important and most carefully obscured lore points. The school sought contact with the moon presence, believed that achieving that contact would represent a transcendence of the kind that the church had always promised but never delivered, and used Yahargul as the operational base for that attempt. The Mensis ritual, which the school was in the process of conducting when you encounter the village, was the culmination of that project. Whether the ritual succeeded in the way the school intended is another question. The imprisoned scholar of Yahargul, found in a specific cage in the village, is one of the most unsettling encounters in the area. This is someone who participated in the school's work and ended up on the inside of one of the school's cages rather than outside it. The distinction between researcher and subject had collapsed in Yahargul to the point where the school's own members could find themselves in the position of the materials they had been using. That collapse says something about the specific character of the School of Mensis and about what their commitment to their research agenda eventually required of them. The nightmare realm associated with Yahargul, the area called the Nightmare of Mensis, is the school's most extraordinary achievement and its most comprehensive failure simultaneously. The school found a way to project their research, their consciousness, their entire agenda into a nightmare realm, a space adjacent to the waking world where the rules that limit human contact with the Great Ones are different or absent. That they were able to do this at all is remarkable. That the version of the realm they produced is what it suggests that the contact they achieved was not what they had been hoping for. The Mensis brain, encountered in the Nightmare of Mensis, is one of the lore's most disturbing creations. This was a human brain that had been transformed by the school's methods into something that had achieved a form of the insight they were seeking, but had sacrificed everything else in the process. The brain floats in its space, radiating madness, connected to whatever the school was trying to contact, and the scholars who are connected to it are reduced to something barely functional. The brain got what it wanted. The scholars got what the brain cost them. The specific sound design of Yahargul, different from other districts, in ways that are immediately apparent even before you understand the law, suggests that the village had been affected by the school's activities at the level of the physical environment. The sounds are wrong in the same way that the sounds of the Nightmare of Mensis are wrong, suggesting that the boundary between the nightmare and the waking district had been compromised by the school's work. Yahargul had been partially incorporated into the nightmare realm, or the nightmare had partially extended into the village, and the sonic environment was the most immediate expression of that overlap. The architectural relationship between Yahargul's lower village streets and its upper ritual spaces reflects the school's operational logic. The lower areas were where collection happened, where the abductors did their work, where the practical infrastructure of the school's supply requirements was managed. The upper areas were where the results of that collection were used, where the ritual work happened, where the school pursued the contact with the Great Ones that justified the infrastructure below. Yahargul was organized vertically around a distinction between means and ends that the school had found perfectly comfortable. The gate at the far end of Yahargul that connects back to the main city, the gate that the player can open to create a shortcut, but also to demonstrate that the village had always been connected to the rest of Yharnam, is a quiet revelation. The school had sealed Yahargul off, not because it was naturally separate, but because it chose to operate separately. The connection to the city was always there, behind a locked door, available to be reopened. The school's isolation was chosen, maintained by policy rather than by geography. The relationship between the School of Mensis and the Healing Church is one of the game's more complex institutional histories. The school was a church faction, operating under the church's broader umbrella, using the church's resources and the church's theological vocabulary while pursuing an agenda that took the church's core commitments further than the church's official leadership was comfortable with. The school believed in what the church taught, believed in the value of the old blood, believed in the project of ascending through contact with the Great Ones. They simply believed more literally and more completely than the church wanted them to. The hunters you encounter in Yahargul who have been killed and reanimated point toward a specific horror that the school had developed. The dead of the village could be recalled, set back into motion, given a partial return to function by the same mechanisms that the school was using for its broader research agenda. This necromantic quality of the school's work was not incidental. It was connected to the same understanding of what the old blood was and what it could do that informed everything else the school pursued. Death in Yahargul was not a terminal state. It was a resource. The specific location of Yahargul in the city's geography, positioned to the side of the main districts, adjacent to the cathedral ward but separated from it, reflects the school's position within the church's power structure. Close enough to draw on the church's resources and authority, far enough to operate without constant oversight. The geographic relationship between Yahargul and the cathedral ward is a spatial expression of the institutional relationship between the School of Mensis and the Healing Church. Affiliated but independent, drawing on the same well but taking the water somewhere, the main institution would rather not look. The end of Yahargul's accessible portion, the transition into the Nightmare of Mensis, is the moment when the district's connection to a space beyond the physical world becomes directly navigable. You're not just in a strange village anymore. You're at a threshold, and the threshold is open, and what is on the other side is the consequence of the school's complete commitment to its vision of transcendence. Yahargul prepared for this crossing. Everything in the village, every abduction, every ritual, every collected body and reanimated corpse was preparation for the moment when the threshold opened and the school's ambitions became physically present in a space beyond the ordinary world. The Yhargul Unseen Village earns its epithet. It was unseen not just because it was hidden from the public, but because what was happening there required not seeing to continue. The church had to not see. The citizens of Yharnam had to not see. Even the hunters whose business it was to see and address the consequences of the old blood's misuse apparently could not or would not see Yhargul clearly until it was too late to contain what had happened there. The village had been conducting its operations in plain sight in the middle of the city, and the not seeing had been comprehensive enough to allow it to proceed to completion. The final quality of Yhargul that the law rewards attention to is the completeness of the school's commitment. The scholars of the School of Menses had not drifted into their position by accident or been pushed into it by circumstance. They had chosen it, step by step, in full knowledge of what they were choosing. They believed in their goal deeply enough to sacrifice the village, their colleagues, themselves, and eventually the boundary between waking reality and the nightmare to get there. That completeness of commitment in service of something that required everything it consumed is the defining characteristic of Yhargul, the place the School of Mensis made, when it decided that the end justified any means the end required. Chapter 8. Cainhurst Castle. Cainhurst is different from every other location in Bloodborne. The other areas of the game, whatever their differences in atmosphere and history, are all connected to the same basic network of institutions and interests. The Healing Church, the Hunters, Björgenwerth, the Pthumerian heritage. Cainhurst is outside all of that. It has its own history, its own relationship with the old blood, its own aristocratic culture that preceded the Healing Church, and that the Church spent considerable resources trying to destroy. Walking into Cainhurst for the first time, you can feel the difference. This is not a church location. This is something older and stranger and, in its own way, more honest about what it is. The physical setting of Cainhurst, a castle on a hill accessible only by carriage and set apart from the rest of the landscape, reflects its social position in the game's world. The aristocracy of Cainhurst had always maintained its separation from the city of Yharnam, had always understood itself as a different kind of institution, with different values and different claims to legitimacy. The castle is not built to integrate with its surroundings. It is built to dominate them, or at least to be clearly separate from them. The architecture is European aristocratic in a way that the church's architecture is not, and the difference is immediately legible as a statement about different sources of power and different understandings of human excellence. The Cainhurst bloodline, the Vile Bloods, as the church called them, had a relationship with blood that predated and differed from the church's blood ministration. The aristocracy of Cainhurst had developed their specific relationship with blood from a source that was not the old blood of the Pthumerian ruins. They had encountered something else, had drunk something different, and the properties of their blood and the nature of their power were distinct from what the church's ministration produced. The church's condemnation of them as vile bloods was partly theological and partly competitive, a refusal to recognise a different path to similar power. The Annalise, Queen of the Vile Bloods, is the castle's central inhabitant and its most significant figure. She is not quite alive in the ordinary sense, but she is not dead in the ordinary sense either. She sits on her throne in the castle's most formal space, and she conducts herself with the composure of someone who has had a very long time to make peace with her situation. Her immortality, such as it is the product of the Cainhurst blood, and the quality of that immortality, the specific way she persists, is one of the clearest illustrations of what the vile blood relationship with blood produces and at what cost. The executioners, Alfred's faction, had been sent to Cainhurst by the church to destroy the Vile Bloods. The history of that campaign and its results is visible in the castle, in the bodies of the executioners who fell there, in the traces of battle that are woven into the castle's current state, The church did not simply win that conflict. The conflict was complicated, the castle was not cleanly taken, and Annalise survived it in the specific way that Annalise survives things. The executioner's presence in Canehurst is both a historical record and an ongoing haunting. The bloodletter weapon associated with the Canehurst aesthetic and tradition represents a different philosophy of hunting than the church's approach. Where the church's hunters used tools designed to manage and contain the beast plague, the bloodletter and the tools associated with Canehurst's tradition were designed around a different understanding of what blood could do and what fighting with blood required. The aristocracy of Canehurst had been fighters, had understood blood as a weapon as well as a source of power, and the weaponry associated with them reflects that understanding. The castle's library, if the Canehurst setting is considered in full, would have contained materials that the church had an interest in destroying or suppressing. The vile blood's understanding of blood, their records of their own history, the accounts of where their lineage had come from, and what their relationship with blood had produced over time, all of this would have been considered dangerous by the church. The fate of those materials, whether they were destroyed in the Executioner campaign or survived in some form, is one of the game's less explored lore questions. The snowfall at Canehurst, the specific atmospheric condition that makes the castle feel set apart not just geographically, but temporally, is part of the location's aesthetic argument. Canehurst does not share the fog of Yharnam. It has its own weather, its own atmosphere, its own version of the night. The snow that falls there cold and clean and indifferent to the horrors that inhabit the castle creates a visual contrast with the blood that saturates the environment. The aristocratic setting of ice and stone and falling snow against the red of the blood and the violence of the castle's inhabitants is one of the game's most carefully realised visual compositions. The Forsaken Castle Canehurst item description tells you something about how the church subsequently memorialised the castle after the Executioner campaign, or rather, how it chose not to memorialise it. Canehurst was made forsaken in the sense of being excluded from the church's official account of Yharnam's history. The church's history did not include a chapter about a rival aristocracy with a different relationship to blood, did not include the acknowledgement that the vile bloods had been something other than pure corruption, did not include any suggestion that the church had destroyed something that had its own forms of value and dignity. The forsaking was an act of narrative control as much as physical destruction. The connection between the Canehurst carriage and the ability to visit the castle, the way access is gated by finding the summons in Hemwick, creates a specific kind of relationship between the player and the location. You are invited to Canehurst. The summons is an invitation, in the formal sense of the word, a piece of communication from the castle to whoever might receive it. Annalise, or the castle itself, is actively reaching out to potential visitors. This is not a location you discover or unlock through conquest. It is one that chose to make itself accessible to you. The Canehurst enemies, the spectres, and the transformed aristocrats tell a story about what the vile blood transformation produces when it proceeds. These are not the same transformation as beasthood. The things that inhabit Canehurst have retained more of their human form than the beasts of Yharnam, but they have also lost more of their human personality, their human social identity. The transformation the vile blood produces tends towards something cold and preserved rather than something animalistic and aggressive. The aristocrats of Canehurst have not become beasts. They have become something more like ruins of people, haunting the ruins of their culture. The throne room of Canehurst, where Annalise sits, is the castle's most formally organised space. The arrangement of the room, the placement of the throne, and the approach to it all point toward a court culture that had been sustained long past the point where it had a court to sustain it. Annalise sits in a throne designed for receiving petitioners, and the petitioners are gone, and she receives whoever comes in the same formal posture that she would have maintained when the court was full. There is a kind of dignity in that persistence and a kind of desolation. The vile blood's concept of their own purpose, the collection of blood dregs from hunters, reflects a different relationship with the hunt than the Church's understanding. The Church hunted to contain the plague. Cainhurst hunted to collect, to accumulate specific qualities of blood that had been refined by the hunting process, qualities that served Cainhurst's own biological project. The two institutions' different attitudes toward the hunt reflect their different understandings of what blood was for and who had the right to determine its use. The beckoning bell and the cauldron ritual items connect Cainhurst to the broader cooperative and competitive multiplayer framework of the game, but their lore significance is about Cainhurst's understanding of what cooperation between hunters meant. For Cainhurst, the exchange between hunters was about blood and what blood carried. The ritual objects associated with Cainhurst participation in the hunt framework reflect the castle's specific theology of blood as carrier, as the medium through which power and identity are transmitted. The specific items obtainable from engaging with Cainhurst's covenant structure include some of the most aesthetically Cainhurst-inflected equipment in the game, with a visual language that is clearly aristocratic rather than ecclesiastical. The armour and weapons of Cainhurst look like things made for people who considered themselves a different order of being from the Church's servants, people who had a different tradition behind them, and who were not going to adopt the Church's visual vocabulary just because the Church had become powerful. That sartorial independence is consistent with the broader picture of Cainhurst as an institution that maintained its distinctness to the end. The connection between Cainhurst and the Thumerian queens, recoverable from the deeper lore threads, is one of the castle's most significant historical associations. If the Vile Blood's lineage has Thumerian roots, then Cainhurst is not simply an aristocratic alternative to the Church's programme. It is a different branch of the same deep history, a different inheritance from the civilization that predated both Yharnam and the Healing Church. The Church and Cainhurst would both, in that reading, be inheritors of the Thumerian legacy, but different aspects of it, and their conflict would be a conflict between different readings of the same foundational heritage. The Alfred questline, when completed in the way that leads to the destruction of Annalise, produces one of the game's most disturbing outcomes precisely because Alfred is not a monster. He believes in what he is doing. He believes in the righteousness of his master's legacy and the necessity of destroying the Vile Bloods. And when he completes his mission, the satisfaction he feels is real, is the satisfaction of someone who has done what he came to do. The horror of what he has done to Annalise is present, but it does not register for Alfred as horror. That gap between what Alfred experiences and what the player experiences looking at the result is what makes the questline so effective. The possibility of reviving Annalise in the chalice ritual context, if the player has the appropriate item, suggests that Annalise's relationship with death is genuinely different from what the Church could offer, or what conventional mortality represents. The Vile Blood transformation produces something that can be destroyed, but that retains the possibility of return, and this quality distinguishes Annalise from the permanent deaths that characterize most of the game's characters. Whether this persistence is a form of life worth having is a question the game leaves open. The view from Cainhurst, if you take a moment to look out from the castle's elevated position, shows a landscape that is genuinely separate from the Yharnam geography you have been moving through. The castle is not visible from the city, and the city is not visible from the castle. The two places exist in the same world, but do not overlap in any visual sense. This physical mutual invisibility is a spatial expression of the institutional relationship between the Church and the Vile Bloods. Each had existed for a long time in the same world, without acknowledging the other's legitimacy, and the geography had cooperated with that mutual blindness. The snowflakes at Cainhurst, each one distinct, each one temporary, are the castle's ambient comment on the kind of beauty that Cainhurst embodied before the church decided to destroy it. The aristocratic culture of Cainhurst had its own forms of excellence, its own aesthetics, its own understanding of what human beings could be at their best. The snow falling on the ruins of that culture, covering the blood and the spectres and the formal rooms where court had once been held, has the quality of nature offering its own kind of preservation to something that the human world has decided to abandon. The castle persists under the snow, cold and strange, and still containing Annalise in her throne room, waiting for whoever accepts the invitation to come and find what is left. The final impression of Cainhurst is of a place that had more integrity than the church ever gave it credit for. It was not simply corruption that the church destroyed, it was an alternative, a different way of understanding the relationship between human beings and the deep strangeness of the world they inhabited. The church called it vile because acknowledging its validity would have complicated the church's own claims. Cainhurst called itself by its own name and sat on its own throne and maintained its own customs, and whatever those customs required of the people who practiced them, they were theirs. Not imposed from above, not managed for the benefit of an institution. The aristocracy of Cainhurst was accountable to its own vision in a way that the church, with all its public-facing theology of healing, never quite managed to be. Chapter 9. The Nightmare Frontier and the Lecture Building. The Nightmare Frontier and the Lecture Building are two locations that the game connects through the unusual architecture of Bloodborne's late-game geography, and taking them together reveals something about the structure of the nightmare realms that the game deploys in its second half. The nightmare spaces of Bloodborne are not random or purely metaphorical. They have specific contents, specific histories, specific reasons for existing as nightmare rather than as ordinary physical space. Understanding why these particular locations are dreams and what that means for their lore is one of the more rewarding interpretive challenges the game offers. The lecture building exists at a junction between the waking world and multiple nightmare spaces, a physical structure that has somehow persisted in a space between ordinary reality and the dream spaces that the game's lore connects to the Great Ones. The building is clearly an academic institution, connected in visual language and in institutional character to Byrgenwerth, suggesting that what happened in the lecture building is part of the same general history of scholarship and overreach that Byrgenwerth represents. The students and scholars who inhabit the nightmare of the building are the people who went too deep and did not find their way back. The creatures in the lecture building, the humanoid nightmarish students, tell a story about what happened to a cohort of people who were studying the exact topics that the game's lore centers on. These were people learning about the Great Ones, about the Old Blood, about the nightmare realms, about the theoretical framework behind the hunt, and the knowledge consumed them, not in the crude beast transformation way of blood ministration gone wrong, but in a more specific and more academic way, a transformation that reflects the specific kind of damage that this particular kind of knowledge does to the people who pursue it without adequate preparation or adequate wisdom. The nightmare frontier is a dream location that feels old, that feels like it has been a nightmare for a very long time before you arrive in it. The specific contents of the nightmare frontier, the enemies, the architecture, the items, all suggest a nightmare that was created by or around a specific set of events involving the Great Ones and their contact with human researchers. This is not a freshly made nightmare. It is an old one, the residue of something that happened a long time ago and that the dream space has been processing ever since. The amygdala boss in the nightmare frontier is one of the game's most important encounters from a lore perspective, not because of what the fight reveals directly, but because of what the location of the fight implies. The amygdala are servants or manifestations of the Great One's presence, and fighting one in the context of a nightmare space that exists because of human contact with the Great Ones suggests that the nightmare itself is in some sense the amygdala's territory, or that the amygdala's presence here is a consequence of whatever created the nightmare. The specific geography of the nightmare frontier, with its poisoned valleys and its elevated areas, and its combination of natural-looking terrain and clearly constructed elements, suggests a nightmare that contains the memory of a real place. Nightmare spaces in Bloodborne tend to be distorted versions of real spaces, places that have been pulled into the dream by significant events or significant presences. The nightmare frontier may be the nightmare version of a real location that no longer exists in the waking world, or it may be the nightmare version of a place that still exists but that has been supplemented and distorted by the dream. The connection between the nightmare frontier and the Pthumerians is visible in the architecture